All right, to both sides. It's a good way to start. Very powerful piece by Rabbi Tzaddik, no? I think it's a very you come across some of these pieces of Chassidus, and it's not just Chassidus. There's a lot of good Torah. Most of it happens to be in Chassidus, but there's also good Torah elsewhere. But there are pieces that are transformative. They're just absolutely transformative in the way you live your life. Anyway, speaking of transformative, another transformative Gemara today. So we'll say we're going to begin by thanking our shiur sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the shiur midrashos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Tina Bas Pesach and Zechariah ben Zechariah. I want to thank our Daf Yomi sponsors today, very beautiful sponsorship as well, the Plonka family, for dedicating the shiur this morning in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Rav Moshe Feinstein, Moshe ben David Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah, and all of Klal Yisrael will have a nechama. All right, so with that, let us begin. So we really have an incredible daf ahead of us today. A lot of Gemara, a lot to do. So today's daf is Tzadik Hey, 95, and we are picking up on Tzadik Daled Amud Beis. Where did we leave off? Gufa, right? Rava Amar Tanaihi. So we are up to 2, 4, 6, 8 lines up from the bottom. For Rava Amar Tanaihi. So we'll say, so remember again, the machlokis we left off with was the dramatic machlokis in the Mishnah. Up until, right, namely, what is the definition of derech rechoka? So we saw the first opinion, the Tanakama, who explained, I should say, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said, from Modi'in and outside, which the Gemara established as a distance of 15 mil. Remember again, there's nothing significant about Modi'in except that Modi'in just represents a distance. This is Modi'in and Yerushalayim, 15 mil. So if you are 15 mil outside of Yerushalayim, ultimately again on Erev Pesach, then halacha l'maisa again, you are b'derech rechoka, and therefore you are nitchet to Pesach Sheni. However, the Mishnah then also quoted the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who said, Me'isikufa, even if you are outside of the threshold of the Beis Hamikdash. So it's like, I'm in Yerushalayim, I'm on the Harabayis, I'm outside the doorway of the Beis Hamikdash. That's called derech rechoka as well. So Rabbi says, now we're picking up with this. So Rava Amar Tanahi. Rabbi says, in reality, this is a machlokes Tana. And here we go. This Sanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ne'emar richok makom bePesach. The Torah speaks about richok makom derech rachok by Pesach. V'ne'emar richok makom b'maiser. And the Torah speaks about being at a distance from Meiser Sheni. Both remember again, for Meiser Sheni, the halacha is that you're supposed to take your produce, your Meiser Sheni produce, to Yerushalayim. Ultimately, again, however, if you are, let's say, too far away and you can't carry all of your produce, what can you do? You could redeem your produce onto money, or transfer the sanctity onto money, bring the money to Yerushalayim and spend the money on food in Yerushalayim. So it says, Richok makom by Pesach, Richok makom by Meiser Sheni. Ma halon chutz lachilaso. So was it just like Meiser Sheni? Derech rechoka means you're too far away from the place in which you would consume the Meiser Sheni, which is where? In Yerushalayim. Afkan chutz lachilaso. So to derech rechoka must mean that you are too far from Yerushalayim, which is the position of Rabbi Akiva, that if you are more than 15 mil outside of Yerushalayim, that's called derech rechoka. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda disagrees. He says no. It doesn't mean that you're too far from the place where Karban Pesach can be consumed, but which is Yerushalayim, but rather you're too far from the place where the Karban Pesach is performed. And we'll see, where's the Karban Pesach performed, so to speak? Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda says, derech rachok means outside of the precincts of Yerushalayim. So literally, outside the precincts of the Beis HaMikdash. So if you're literally standing outside of the Beis HaMikdash, that's called derech rachoka. The Gemara says, Kiman Azla, Hadar Yitzchak by Yosef. So according to whose opinion is the following statement made? B'tmeim halach acharov ha'omdim bazra. What's an interesting statement? That remember again, we've spoken about the idea that if the majority of Klal Yisrael is Tamei, then halacha l'maisa, the carbon could be offered up by Tumah. Where the majority of who establishes that majority? So this particular opinion says we look at the majority of people standing inside of the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. So whose opinion does that reflect? That's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Ultimately, the name of Rabbi Eliezer, namely that derech rechoka is established by proximity to the Beis Hamikdash, not proximity to Yerushalayim. Good. Amar lo Rabbi Yossi lefichach. So I will say again, so Rabbi Yossi said, therefore, this is the end of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi said, this is why on the word rechoka, there's a little dot over the hay, ultimately teaching us that rechoka doesn't really have to mean geographically far. It just means that you're outside of the place where you are supposed to be. Again, this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, that even if you are outside of the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash, at the time of the offering of the karban, that is called derech rechoka. Says the Gemara Tanya, Rabbi Yossi Lili Omer, derech shamea ani mahalich shnayim o shloshi yamim. Now we'll say when the pasuk says derech rechoka, I might have thought it means a journey of 2 or 3 days, right? If you ask me, how far is far? So I don't know, is 15 mil far? 2 or 3 days. Kishu Omer ubaderech lohaya magid shemisikufa sa'azara ulachutz karedech. I will say, but once it says ubaderech lohaya, and it doesn't use the word rechoka, derech could even mean what? Or derech rechoka could even mean what? Outside of the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash. Good. So I will say, so this is the fundamental machlokes Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer. How far is far? Rabbi Akiva saying 15 mil out of Yerushalayim, which also, of course, is even further than from the actual Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Eliezer is saying even outside of the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash. So we'll say, so how do we paskin? So the Rambam paskins in Perek Hey, Halacha Ches, one line, Ve'ezohi derech rechoka. What is derech rechoka? Chamisha asar mil chutz lechomas Yerushalayim. We'll say, what's derech rechoka? 15 mil outside of the walls of Yerushalayim. So this is very important. Remember, when we think about the walls of Yerushalayim, you think about which walls? Right? The walls of the old city. Remember, again, I will say, those are not the walls. Those are the walls of the old city. That's not, remember, Yerushalayim was a walled city, which means at the border of the city there was a wall. So imagine, that beautiful sign when you're driving in, from Highway 1 into Yerushalayim, and you see that beautiful sign that says "Welcome to Yerushalayim," probably the most magnificent sign in the entire universe. It says "Welcome to Yerushalayim." So if you could imagine, again, I think historically, actually, the municipal borders of Yerushalayim were actually larger than what they are now. But Lamaisa, you walked into a wall, you would come into a walled city. So just pointing out when the Rambam says it's 15 mil from the external wall of the city. So we paskin like Rabbi Akiva. I just want to point out, like B'derech Hashkafa, what's the svara? Like Rabbi Eliezer says, if you're outside of the Beis Hamikdash, that's called derech rechoka. Okay, so he dashes the pasuk. But you understand like the incredible musar in this? Sometimes you could be so close to your desired location, but yet still so far. You could be standing right outside of your mikdash. You could be standing so close to your spiritual goals, dreams, and aspirations. Yet for a variety of reasons, all you need to do is take one step. Right, this guy, Rabbi Eliezer, is describing, he's standing right outside of the Beis Hamikdash. You're right there. Just take a step forward. But sometimes we're so close to actualizing such incredible spiritual greatness, but either we're afraid to take the step, we lack the confidence to take the step, we don't actually realize how close we are, and so we remain outside. Nebuch for the person who's standing right there, Erev Pesach, and just doesn't have the understanding or the courage to take the step inside. So many times in life, the things we really want are actually within reach, so much closer than we ever realize. We just have to open our eyes, be attentive, and find the courage to move ourselves forward. So we'll say with that, the Mishnah goes on. We'll say, great sugya ahead of us now. Top of Tzadikeh, it's very exciting, very exciting. Ma bein Pesach Rishon and Rishon, the Sheni. We'll say, what's the difference between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni? Okay, so now, interestingly enough, we've gone through Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. We've seen, right, we've been doing the entire sugya of Pesach Sheni up until now. So wherein lies the difference between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni? So the Gemara says, here we go. Harishon asar ba'yira ba'yim, atzva Sheni chametz matzim obayis. Well, it's very interesting. Pesach Rishon, so remember again, there's an Isur Chametz. Pesach Sheni, that does not apply. Very interesting, right? Can you imagine this? Like essentially you're off, which again, it makes sense because supposed to remember again, what is Pesach Sheni? Pesach Sheni is only what? Karban, right? This is very important. Pesach Sheni, it's not a second Yom Tov. Remember, Pesach Sheni is the makeup for the Karban. It's not the makeup for Yom Tov. Right? I just want to be clear about this. I know you know this, but I'm just going to say it. It's not the pshat that the guy who is B'derech Rechoka doesn't observe Pesach. He's like, all right, let's, not going to make it to Yerushalayim, let's go out for bagels. That's not, obviously, you're missing the Karban, but you're still observing the Yom Tiv. So all you're making up on Pesach Sheni, therefore, is the Karban. So therefore, the Isser Chametz doesn't apply. There's Isser Chametz on Pesach Rishon, no Isser Chametz on Pesach Sheni. Listen to this. Harishon ta'un halal ba'achila. So beautiful. We'll say when you would eat Pesach Rishon, ultimately what? You would go ahead and say Hallel when you were eating Pesach Rishon. V'asheni eno ta'un halal ba'achilaso. But Pesach Sheni does not have Hallel with its consumption. With its consumption. Remember again, we saw before the beautiful Gemara that said how would they say Hallel? When it says Hallel with the eating, B'pashtos, maybe they would sing Hallel also with their eating. But remember, they would eat in the house, and then everybody would go up to the rooftops. Right? So you can imagine this scene, all the rooftops filled with people singing Hallel on the night of Pesach. Hallel will be zochem, Yeretz Hashem, to see that soon. So the Gemara goes, the Mishnah goes weiter. I will say both by Pesach Rishon as well as by Pesach Sheni. They would say Hallel during the actual offering of the Karban. Right? I will say we saw this as well. That as the Karban Pesach was actually being shechted, the Chaburas would say Hallel. So the Gemara says, ultimately, again, both Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni are roasted. Tzli, matzah simram with matzah and marar, v'dochen as Shabbos. And again, both Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni are docha Shabbos. Incredible. So we'll say now, let's go. It says the Gemara. We'll say, so now the interesting question, of course, is going to be, how do we figure out which things do apply to Pesach Sheni, which things don't apply to Pesach Sheni? So remember again, so here we go. Tan Rabbanon. So we'll say when the Torah discusses Pesach Sheni, so the lashon that's given is so you have to perform Pesach Sheni exactly the same way. Well, it sounds like exactly the same way that you would perform Pesach Rishon. All of the laws of Pesach Rishon apply to Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara says, what does that refer to? B'mitzvah shebegufa kosov medaber. So we'll say what that refers to is what the Gemara is now calling mitzvos shebegufo. So we'll say mitzvos shebegufo means anything done to the actual karban itself that's done on Pesach Rishon is also done on Pesach Sheni. Take a quick look at Rashi for just a moment. Mitzvos shebegufo akasav medaber lo riba es hasheni ledin Rishon elo b'mitzvos shebegufo kigon sedra avodosav va'achilas tzli. Avalo lemitzvos she'iron begufo kimon hashbasa sa'ar. So we'll say the way the Gemara is understanding this is as follows. When it says kichol chukos haPesach, what that means is that anything done to the actual karban itself, right? However the karban is offered, right? All the different halachos concerning the karban, the manner in which the karban is prepared, tzli, all of that applies to Pesach Sheni as well. However, we'll say based on this, things or details that are not part of the actual karban itself. For example, chametz, right? Or the prohibition of chametz, which is not a din in karban Pesach. It's a din in Pesach that doesn't apply ultimately to Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara says, let's go back there. So the Gemara says, so just remember, the mitzvah shebegufo means any mitzvah or any halacha that applies to the karban itself. Mitzvah sha'al gufo minayin. So we'll say now another term. What about a mitzvah sha'al gufo? Now, what does this mean, a mitzvah sha'al gufo? What about a mitzvah, something that accompanies the Karban Pesach? For example, matzah and maror. Matzah and maror. So matzah and maror is not inherently part of the avodah of Pesach, but again, at least by Pesach Rishon, the lashon is al matzos umerorim yochluhu. You eat the Pesach with matzah and maror. That's a mitzvah sha'al gufo. It's an accessory. So what about accessory mitzvahs? Talmud lomar al matzos umerorim yochluhu. Therefore, the pasuk says you should eat even Pesach Sheni with matzah and mutter. Yochal afilu mitzvos shelo al gufo. You might have thought, therefore, again, maybe. So I'll say, I'm including mitzvos shebegufo, which ultimately again means the carbon is prepared the same way. Mitzvos sha'al gufo, anything that accompanies the carbon Pesach and Pesach Rishon, accompanies on Pesach Sheni, i.e. matzah and mutter. So maybe I should include mitzvos shelo al gufo. We'll say, what's mitzvos shelo al gufo? What does that include? Chametz. Chametz. So maybe I should include chametz as well. Talmud Lomar, ve'etzem lo yishberu bo. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk says again, this is by Pesach Sheni. You can't break a bone in Pesach Sheni. So why does the Torah say that? Mashviras ha'etzem miyuchad mitzvah shebegufo. Just like the breaking of the bone is what we call a mitzvah shebegufo. It's a mitzvah. It's a detail in the carbon. Af kol mitzvah shebegufo. So too, it only comes to include mitzvah shebegufo. Now, both say. Now, the truth is, remember, we've already established that we're including mitzvah shebegufo and mitzvos ultimately again sha'al gufo. But the point that the Gemara is making is it's only going to be mitzvah shebegufo, mitzvah sha'al gufo that apply to Pesach Sheni, but mitzvos shelo al gufo, which means essentially Pesach details that are just fundamentally extraneous to the carbon itself will not apply on Pesach Sheni. And again, it's very logical because mitzvos that are extraneous to carbon Pesach ultimately again are a din in Pesach, not a din in carbon. Pesach Sheni is not a makeup for Yom Tiv. Pesach Sheni is a makeup for the carbon. Isi ben Yehuda Omer, Yasu also, you shall perform it. Rabbi said these are all phrases from the same pasuk by Pesach Sheni. So Yasu also, the mitzvos shebegufo hakosov medaber. Siyasu also, both say this refers to mitzvos shebegufo, mitzvos ultimately again in the actual carbon itself. Amar Mar, yochol af mitzvah shelo al gufo. You might have thought that halacha lemaisa, I should include mitzvah shelo al gufo, which I will say again refers to, let's say, chametz. So the Gemara says amrit b'mitzvah. I'm sorry. So Amar Mar yochol af mitzvah shelo al gufo. Ha amrit b'mitzvah shebigufo hakosem medaber. But one second, Bosa, you just said before that the pasuk is coming to teach me that it's only b'mitzvah shebigufo that the pasuk is referring to. Hachikam. This is what it means to say hashta da amrit amatzos umerorim yochluhu almayasu oso lav dafka. Shabbos says, interestingly enough, as follows. Now that we've established that Pesach Sheni does in fact have matzah and maror, so that tells me that Yasu also is not miduyak. What does that mean? The Yasu also, that phrase by itself, Yasu also, if that would have been just by itself, I would have assumed that what does that mean? That Allah Chalamaysa, you just offer up the carbon Pesach. That's it. And I would say any of the details that apply to Pesach, to the actual carbon itself, preparation of the carbon, right? How you offer up the carbon, manner of preparation, sleeve, that applies. But I would have thought that Yasu also tells me that anything else, even matzah mar doesn't apply. Now the pasuk says you also have to offer up matzah, you also have to eat that matzah sumar miyochlu. Alma Yasu also lav dafka. Therefore, we'll say the phrase Yasu also is not precise in limiting. So the Gemara says ha'ema. How the Gemara says lav dafku ema havileke pratu klal. Therefore, I would say maybe the pasuk should be read as a prat and a klal. V'naaseh klal mosif al haprat, and therefore perhaps the klal itself comes to add on to the prat. Va'afilu kol milinami, and maybe it comes to include everything, and maybe it tells you that whatever applies during the time of consumption of Pesach Rishon applies during the consumption of Pesach Sheni. Even what? Even chametz. Kamashman Rabbi said that is not the case. Rabbi said, therefore, the way the Gemara ends up ultimately discussing this is as follows. What we'll call mitzvos shebigufo, anything that applies to the actual preparation of the carbon, same for Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Mitzvos sha'al gufo, we'll call accessories to the carbon, will apply to Pesach Sheni as well. Therefore, again, Pesach Sheni is also consumed with matzah and moror. The distinction between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni is what we call mitzvos shelo al gufo. Anything that is fundamentally extraneous to the Pesach, which for our purposes refers to chametz. So the Isser chametz will apply on Pesach Rishon, but the Isser chametz will not apply on Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara goes weiter. Isi ben Yehuda, Hi etzem my avidle. So we'll say, what does Isi ben Yehuda do with etzem? So the Gemara says, in other words, we'll say, what does he do with that drasha that says he's not allowed to break a bone for for Pesach Sheni? So my avidle mi baile leechad etzem sheyesh b'moach ve'echad etzem she'in b'moach. So we'll say Isi ben Yehuda uses it to learn that the prohibition of shiras etzem, of breaking a bone, is true whether it is a bone that has marrow or a bone that doesn't have marrow. V'Rabbanan hayasu oso my avdile. What do the Rabbanan do with the phrase of yasu oso? Mibayle she'in shochten esa pesach al hayachid. Both say this is fascinating. So the Rabbanan understand the phrase yasu oso means they, plural, will perform it. The Rabbanan use this to learn that halacha l'maisa, we prefer that you don't shecht the carbon pesach for an individual. Both say we discussed this sugi before. The halacha l'maisa, are you allowed to shecht a carbon for an individual? The answer is yes. You can do it, but the Rabbanan feel it's highly unpreferable. And therefore, the kama de efshar ladure mahadrinan. The more you could go ahead and run after people, the more you could try to find people with whom to share your carbon pesach, that is definitely preferable. We'll say, take a look at Rashi. This is actually wild. Get ready for this. Rashi says over here, shein shochten, Pesach Sheni al hayachid shenitchalo lahachi kasav yasu lashon rabim. So we'll say, so the Rabbanan understand over here that we don't want you doing Pesach Sheni alone. The truth is, it's a din in Pesach Rishon as well. It's very clear logic. The logic is that we don't want to create nosar unnecessarily. So by Pesach, but let's focus on Pesach Sheni. So by Pesach Sheni it says yasu also, which means we ideally don't want you offering up the carbon by yourself. And therefore, to whatever degree you could gather up a chabura, you should do so. So we'll say, look at Rashi. This is actually pretty wild. Rashi says, the kama de efshar ladure. So the more you could go and find someone else to share in your carbon in your Pesach Sheni. So the kama de efshar ladure achar tamich chavero limnoso imam mahadrinan. So we'll say, so to whatever degree you could find the chaver who's also tamei at Pesach Rishon, and he could join you for Pesach Sheni. That is definitely preferable. Kigon. Letame achar b'sheretz. So we'll say, this is actually pretty wild because it sounds like what Rashi is saying is, even if you have to be metame your friend, right, in order that he could join you for Pesach Sheni, right? Go ahead, say here, catch this. And it turns out that you threw him a dead sheretz. So now again, he's your buddy for Pesach Sheni. I mean, he might not be your buddy for too much longer, but Lamaisa at least he's imanochi b'tzara by Pesach Sheni. Ksiv also fine. So again, so therefore Chazal understand this. The Rabbanan understand this. Yasu also, to whatever degree possible, don't offer up a Pesach Sheni alone, but rather try to find other people who are tamei as well. Tan Rabbanan, kechol chukas haPesach yasu also. The pasuk says, "G'navos Pesach Sheni," that you should offer up Pesach Sheni. Excuse me. Sorry. Kechol chukas haPesach yasu also. You should offer up the Karban Pesach, the Pesach Sheni, in accordance with all of the halachas of Pesach Rishon. Yochol kashem sharishon asr b'bayira bayimatzeh kach sheni asr b'bayira bayimatzeh. So again, you would have thought, therefore, the same way that Pesach Rishon has an Isser Chametz, so too Pesach Sheni has an Isser Chametz. Talmud Lomar al matzos umirorim yochluhu. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk says, "You shall eat it on matzah and maror," which tells you that again, only mitzvos sheva gufo and mitzvos sha'al gufo are part of Pesach Sheni. But mitzvos shelo al gufo, i.e. mitzvos that are totally extraneous to Pesach Sheni, halacha l'maisa, those are not done by Pesach Rish. Only things that are totally extraneous to Karban Pesach are not done on Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara says, ve'eni ela mitzvos aseh. This is actually very interesting. I only know that Pesach Sheni, that it refers to mitzvos aseh, mitzvos lo saseh minai. And about say, how do I know that even mitzvos lo saseh also apply to Karban Pesach Sheni? Talmud Lomar, lo yashiru mimeno ad boker. Because we'll say by Pesach Sheni, the Torah also says, you shall not leave anything over until the morning, which is a lo saseh. So we see over here that positive commandments that refer to Karban Pesach apply to Pesach Sheni. Prohibitions which apply to Pesach Rishon apply to Pesach Sheni. Ve'eni ela mitzvos aseh sheni tak la'aseh. But I only know that it applies to, we'll say, what we call prohibitions that are remedied by a positive commandment. So what does this mean? I will say, for example, the Torah says you're not allowed to leave over anything until the morning. And then what does the Torah say? And whatever you leave over until the morning, ba'ish tisrofu. So this is called a lav hanitak la'aseh. So a lav hanitak la'aseh is a prohibition which could be remedied by the performance of a positive commandment. The paradigmatic example of that, I will say, is gzela. I steal something, that is a lav, but it is a lav hanitak la'aseh. Why? Beheshev es hagizela. I can return the stolen item. So some lavin you could fix, so to speak, and others, well, you could always fix a lav, but some lavin have a positive commandment, a sister positive commandment to remedy it. So leaving over Karban Pesach, lo sir menu ad boker, is a prohibition, but it's nitak la'aseh, because if you do leave over, there's a way to remedy that prohibition, i.e. you burn the nosar. So I only know that a lav hanitak la'aseh applies to Pesach Sheni. What about mitzvahs lo saseh garminayin? We'll say, what about if you have just a bona fide prohibition? A mitzvahs lo saseh with no corresponding aseh to remedy it. How do I know that applies to Pesach Sheni as well? Tamalomar ve'etzem lo yishperu bo. The pasuk says you shall not break a bone. So we'll say that's just a plain lav. So therefore, ma prat mufurash mitzvahs aseh. Velo saseh shenitak la'aseh, velo saseh gomer, avkol mitzvahs aseh, velo saseh shenitak la'aseh, velo saseh gomer. So we'll say, therefore, what comes out, fascinating limud. Therefore, essentially what the Gemara says is like this: any lo saseh, or I should say, any aseh positive commandment, any lo saseh anitak la'aseh, any prohibition that's remedied by a positive commandment, or any stam prohibition, any stam lo saseh that applies to Pesach Rishon, will apply to Pesach Sheni. That's the cloud that the Gemara is espousing. Incredible. So says the Gemara, Bichlale demasosumro, my Rabbi. So we'll say, so now, interestingly enough, we see the Torah goes out of its way to list certain specific items in the performance of Pesach Sheni. So we'll say, remember again, so on one hand, I'm learning certain principles, but yet the Torah also goes out of its way to list certain things specifically. So for example, the Torah tells me specifically that by Pesach Sheni, I have to eat it on matzah umarorim. So when the Torah states that, what else is it coming to include? To which the Gemara answers, tzli eish is coming to include that the carbon has to be roasted. That essentially the same way that you have to consume Pesach Sheni, the same way you consume Pesach Rishon, i.e. with matzah and maror, so too Pesach Sheni has to be prepared in the same way like Pesach Rishon, i.e. tzli eish. Good. Biprate my memaidle, and I will say by stating amatzumram yochlu by Pesach Sheni, what is it coming to exclude? So the Gemara says memaidle hashbasa sa'ar is coming to exclude chametz, right? Or the need to get rid of your chametz. That only applies by Pesach Rishon, doesn't apply by Pesach Sheni. So why don't you? I don't say why can't you just easily like switch that around? Why can't you say that matzah sumar comes to include hashbasa sar, the need to rid yourself of chametz, and comes to exclude tzli? To which the Gemara says very simply, mitzvah de gufe adif, because they both say it makes much more sense to include tzli and exclude sa'ar. Why? Because they both say tzli is, as we said before, a mitzvah shebegufo. That is a detail in the actual carbon itself, as opposed to hashbasas sa'ar, which is not a din in the carbon itself. So also when the Torah says, by Pesach Sheni, that you should not go ahead and leave over anything until the morning. What else? What is that detail coming to include? To which the Gemara says, so ultimately it's coming to include that you cannot go ahead and remove the Karban Pesach from the place where you are eating. Right? This is the din by Pesach Rishon that we saw. So remember again, when we had this discussion, you could split one Karban into two parts to be consumed by a divided chabura in two locations. But what can't you do? You can't eat, one person can't eat in two places. So therefore the Gemara says, I learned from the fact that the Torah says you can't leave over anything, that also teaches me that the detail of not taking the carbon out from the place where I'm eating also applies. Biprate, I'm skipping the parentheses, biprate my kamamaidle, and I will say ultimately again, what is it coming to exclude? So lo yirav lo yimad, it's coming to exclude the prohibition of chametz. I says the Gemara, skip the parentheses again, eifach ana, but why not switch that around? Once again, mitzvah digufei adif. because it makes more sense to include a mitzvah or a detail which is actually a chilek of the halacha of the carbon itself. Bichlale de etzem lo yishperu bo. So we'll say when the Torah says you should not break a bone of Pesach Sheni, that statement, what is it coming to include? Amadeus, my kamarabi, what is it coming to include? Al tochlu mimenu no. It's coming to include the prohibition to eat carbon Pesach raw. You can't eat raw carbon Pesach. Bipratei my kamamaydle. And what is it coming to exclude? Lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. It's coming to exclude the halacha that says that when you shecht Korban Pesach, you cannot have any chametz in your possession. That's a din in Pesach Rishon, not a din in Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara says, maybe you could switch it around. Once again, mitzvah de gufe adif. It makes more sense to include details that are unique, that are part of the actual Korban Pesach, and exclude details which are extraneous. So we'll say, so just to bring this together, it's very intuitive. Essentially what the Gemara says, the halacha Rabbi say is that when it comes to Pesach Sheni, what we call three categories of mitzvos. Let me take that back. Pesach Rishon, there are three categories of mitzvos. There's what the Gemara called mitzvos shebegufo. Mitzvah shebigufo means details related to the actual offering, preparation, and nature of consumption of the carbon. Those halachas apply to both Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. So that's how you offer the carbon. That's eating the carbon roasted. That's not eating the carbon raw. Okay, then there's what we call mitzvos sha'al gufo, which means mitzvos that are not directly related ultimately again to the actual preparation of the carbon, but I should say associated carbonic details. Eating it with matzah and maror, not taking it out of the house. Those halachos will also apply to Pesach Rishon and to Pesach Sheni. The third category is where the distinction lies. The third category is what the Gemara called mitzvos shalo al gufo, which essentially are hilchos Pesach, not really related to the carbon. So the example of that being, for example, you're not allowed to shecht while you still have chametz, or bal yera'eh bal yematzeh, or achilas chametz. Those halachas apply to Pesach Rishon, do not apply to Pesach Sheni. And both say that indeed is the halacha l'maisa. Both say now some incredible Gemaras. Incredible. Harishon. Right, Chevron on Zoom, you with me over here? Good. One day I'm going to have to unmute all of you guys. I feel bad. I feel like you're in the corner. I mute you every day, and I never get to hear from you. I'm sorry. And now my screen is to the side. I'm sorry. It's wonderful to see all of you. All right, Tavase, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. So remember again, the Mishnah said, one of the interesting distinctions over here is that by the Rishon they say Hallel, by the Rishon they say Hallel by the Achila, right? The Rishon ton Hallel b'Achilaso, v'Hasheni eno ton Hallel b'Achilaso. So one of the interesting distinctions was recitation of Hallel. By Pesach Rishon you say Hallel when you're eating the carbon. By Pesach Sheni you do not. So also listen to this. Menahan Emili says, how do you know this? I don't know. I was about to say, how do you know you don't say Hallel? So Rabbi Yochanan Mishram Bisham Ben Yosef Amrakra, because we'll say the pasuk says here, the Gemara is quoting the pasuk from Yeshaya, Hashir Yiyeh Lachem Kalel His Kadesh Chad, which I will say literally means the shiur. The song will be for you on the night that was sanctified as a Yom Tiv. And we darshan from there, Laila HaMekudash L'Chag Ta'un Hallel. It is only the nighttime that is sanctified as a Yom Tiv that gets Hallel. Laila she'ein mekudesh l'chag, but a nighttime that is not sanctified as a Yom Tiv doesn't get Hallel. So therefore, I will say the Gemara says, remember, I will say when you offer a Pesach Sheni, is Pesach Sheni a Yom Tiv? Is it a Yom Tiv? Remember, for some it is, especially if it falls out on a Monday or Thursday, because you don't say Tachnun, right? But aside from that Yom Tiv component of it, Lamaisa Pesach Sheni is not a Yom Tiv. Some eat matzah on your Pesach Sheni, but Lamaisa there's no. So therefore, it's fascinating. The only time that there's an obligation to say Hallel at night during consumption is when the nighttime is a Yom Tiv. But Lamaisa, if the nighttime is not a Yom Tiv, there's no obligation to say Hallel. I'll tell you, I think there's also an incredibly profound embedded message in that. So look at these words. The Gemara says, Laila hamekudash l'chag ta'on Hallel. I will say in general, Laila is a metaphor for difficulty and adversity. Right? That's lahagid baboker chastecha b'munoscha Baleilos. So Laila is always a metaphor for difficulty and adversity. So perhaps what Chazal are also saying is like this: Laila hamakudesh l'chag. If you have the ability somehow to take your adversity and to turn it into a Yom Tov, if you somehow find the strength to meet your challenges and to understand that your challenges in life are not there to hold you back, but your challenges sometimes can become the greatest catalyst for growth. That's a Laila hamikudash l'chag. When you turn your Laila into a Yom Tov, when you turn your challenges and adversity into a catalyst for growth, that's ta'un halal. That's ultimately, again, when you say halal in life. The greatest halal, Rabbi say, in life is when you grow from adversity. When you let adversity sideline you, that's tragic. But when adversity becomes the catalyst for growth, when it's a Laila hamekudash l'chag, that's when you say halal in life. An incredible yisod. So we'll say the Gemara goes weiter. Zev zetun halal b'asiyasan. So remember again, both of them require halal b'asiyasan. So both Pesach Sheni and Pesach Rishon, halacha l'maisa, you go ahead and you say halal when you are going ahead and actually performing the carbon. So my time, what's the reason? Ibais ema laila kamamayit yom lo kamamayit. So you could say Pashat Pshat is that what? That halacha l'maisa, the only reason I know not to say halal when I eat Pesach Sheni is why? Because it's based on the pasuk in Yeshai, and the pasuk says Laila. So it's only Laila that's not Mekudesh L'chag that you don't say halal. But by day when I'm offering up the carbon, b'pashtas I say halal. That's one possibility. We'll say this is so beautiful. V'bay sema, efshar yisrael shochten es peschayen, v'notlin es lulavein ve'ein omrin halal. Is it possible for Klal Yisrael to go and shech their Pesach and take their lulav and not say halal? We'll see what the Gemara is saying over here. The essence of mitzvah, Rabbi say, is that if I do a mitzvah and I truly appreciate what it is that I have to do, and I truly appreciate the opportunity in a mitzvah to serve the Ribono Shel Olam, and a recognition, I will say, that a mitzvah is not an end, but it's a means. And every single mitzvah is the Ribono Shel Olam telling me, this is the way you could connect to me. This is the way we create relationship. This is the way we become closer. This is the way you actualize your inner holiness. Then it's almost as if when you perform a mitzvah, you burst into spontaneous halal. The Gemara says, Efshar, is it possible to offer up a carbon Pesach and not say halal? It's almost as if, what are you talking about? That we're looking for the source that I have to say halal? What are you talking about looking for the source? It's almost as if it's a spontaneous spiritual reaction. The same way, is it possible to lift up a lulav and esrog and not say halal? Is it possible to serve the Ribono Shel Olam and not want to burst into song? We'll say, do you understand? This is what Yiddishkeit is supposed to be. It's supposed to be. Sometimes what Judaism is and what it's supposed to be often don't line up. And sometimes, unfortunately, again, mitzvos are often looked at as an all, as a burden, as something I have to do. And we spend so much time and energy looking for the golden kula, right? What's the golden kula? The golden kula, it's the one that's going to get you out of doing the thing you really don't want to do. And we're imaginative and we're creative and we have ashkafas and halachas and halichos and deis and shitas and all different things. And meanwhile, we're totally missing the boat, because a mitzvah, whether it's hard or whether it's easy, is the greatest opportunity for connection. And in the eyes of Chazal, a mitzvah, you have the opportunity to do a mitzvah, of course you burst into halal. So I was thinking, you know what the Gemara is saying over here? I just want to point out, this is a very non-Gemara-like answer. You would expect to see this in the Sifrei Chasidus, which is like, we're trying to figure out, how do you know that you say halal during the asiyah of the carbon? To which the Gemara says, well, how can you offer up a carbon without halal? It's not a halacha. It's not a halacha. It's hashkafas hachayim. How do you serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu without bursting into halal? I'll say this is what we have to strive to get to. This is our goal. This is our goal, that our avodas Hashem should be so beautiful, should be so sweet, that every single thing I do should trigger a spontaneous halal. Not literally, not to say halal. Remember again, the Gemara says, you're not allowed to say halal every day, even if you want to, but to trigger some emotional spontaneity. It is such a privilege to serve. It is such a privilege to do. It is such a privilege to connect with the Ribono Shel Olam. Such an incredible Gemara. Efshar yisrael shochten es peschayen, v'notlin es lulavein, ve'ein omrim halal. Is it possible to do a mitzvah and not want to burst into Hallel? Now, obviously, it's talking over here about episodic mitzvahs, right? Pesach, Lulav. So, of course, there's a difference between things that occur, infrequently and things that occur every single day. But is it possible that you finally have the opportunity to do a Karban Pesach, to pick up Lulav and Esrog, and you're not going to burst into Hallel? It's spontaneous. Incredible. Says, I just want to point out two lines. I told you. You see, people think that when I send out these WhatsApp messages about, dramatic Gemara, that I'm just trying to up my attendance numbers. That is true. But also say, come on. This, I just want to tell you something. No matter what happens in the rest of your day, it's a good day. It's a good day when by 6:38, Reb Tzaddik has changed my life. Meseches Pesachim Daf Tzaddik has changed my life. It's going to be a great day. I haven't even been up for an hour and a half yet. And Lamaisa, again, look, my life has already fundamentally changed. Incredible. V'ne'achol and sleep. So what was this? Remember again. So the Mishnah then said, Pesach Sheni is Docha Shabbos. Pesach Sheni is eaten sli, and it's ultimately Docha Shabbos. So the Gemara makes an interesting observation. The Gemara says Shabbos in Tumalo. Now it's interesting. The Mishnah said it's Docha Shabbos. The Mishnah didn't say that it's Docha Tuma. Rabbi said this raises a very interesting question. So watch. So we'll say. So what happens if everybody's tamei during Pesach Sheni? What happens? So the Gemara says, "Maslisin lo Rabbi Yehuda." It's not like Rabbi Yehuda. The Sanya doches haShabbos ve'in doches haTuma. Remember again, the Brisa says, Pesach Sheni is doches Shabbos, but it's not doches Tuma. Rabbi Yehuda Omer af doches haTuma. Rabbi Yehuda says it's even doches Tuma. So both say machlokes. So fundamental machlokes. Is Pesach Sheni Docha Tuma or not? My time at the Tanakama. What's the Tanakama's logic? Why isn't Pesach Sheni Docha Tuma? So I said, well, look what the Tanakama says. It's great. Mishum Tuma Dechisiv Yachzor V'Yaseh B'Tuma. We'll say, why are you doing Pesach Sheni? Bepashtos, why are you doing Pesach Sheni? Obviously, it's either Derech Chok or Tuma. But I would venture to say, again, I don't know this to be historically true, but it feels true. It's always good to say stuff that you say feels true, because you don't really have any responsibility for it. Right? It feels true that most times when people didn't offer up Pesach Rishon, it wasn't because of Derech Rechoka, because Derech Rechoka, I feel, is something that you could really. But the Pashtos Tuma, so the Tanakama says, why are you doing Pesach Sheni? Because you became Tameh. So now we're going to let you do Pesach Sheni B'Tuma? That's totally counterintuitive. So the Gemara said, Tuma Dechisiv, Yachzor V'Yaseh B'Tuma. The guy was Tameh Pesach Rishon, now we're going to let him do Pesach Sheni B'Tuma. It doesn't make sense. Rabbi Yehuda, HaTorah Chazra, Alav Las also B'Tara. Lo Zachsa Yaseh B'Tuma. Rabbi Yehuda says, look, obviously Pesach Sheni was there so that he could do it B'Tara. But if you can't do it B'Tara, then what? Do it B'Tuma. It's Docha Tuma. It's supposed to be Mechlogis Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, and Tanakama. So the Gemara says, Tana Rabbanan, Pesach Rishon Doches HaShabbos, Pesach Sheni Doches HaShabbos. So the Brisa says, Pesach Rishon is Doches Shabbos, Pesach Sheni is also Doches Shabbos. Pesach Rishon Doches HaTuma, Pesach Sheni Doches HaTuma. So too, Pesach Rishon is Doches HaTuma, Pesach Sheni is also Doches HaTuma. Pesach Rishon Ta'on Lina, Pesach Sheni Ta'on Lina. Pesach Rishon, you have to stay in Yerushalayim that night. Rabbi say, right? You can't eat your Korban Pesach and go home that night. You must stay in Yerushalayim overnight until the next morning. So to Pesach Sheni, Ta'un Lina. Pesach Sheni also requires staying over in Yerushalayim overnight. So the Gemara says, Docha Zadoma, Pesach Sheni is Docha Tuma. Kiman, Rabbi Yehuda. That's the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. Ul Rabbi Yehuda Ta'un Lina. But Rabbi says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, does Pesach Sheni require Lina? Do you have to stay over in Yerushalayim that night of Pesach Sheni? So Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Minayin lePesach Sheni Shein Ta'on Lina. Yet Rabbi Yehuda said, how do we know that Pesach Sheni doesn't require Lina? Shenemar Upanisa Baboker V'Alachta Alecha. The pasuk says in the morning, you shall go back to your tent. Going back to your tent also means going back home, wherever home is. Uksiv Sheishes Yamim Tocha Matzos. So yet the pasuk right afterwards says, and for 6 days you shall eat matzah. And we darshan from there, ta'on lina. If you eat matzah for 6 more days, because remember again, you're already in your shine for the first day, that Yom Tov, which requires consumption of matzah for 6 days, requires lina on the first night. Ta'on lina. And whoever doesn't require consumption of matzah for the remaining 6 days of Yom Tov doesn't require lina, which would seem to indicate that halacha l'maaseh there is no din of lina on Pesach Sheni, to which the Gemara says, Trei Tanoi va'aliba de Rabbi Huda. There are two different Tanoim according to Rabbi Huda. And I will say, so again, just to mention this very quickly, so the Rambam in Perek Yud, Halacha Tes Vav, writes as follows. Perek Yud, Halacha Tes Vav, just by Docha Tuma, says, so the Gemara goes through this. The Gemara goes through this whole list. The Gemara says, the Rambam says, sorry. Again, maybe we'll go through this from a different time. I'll give you the Maramakum. This is Perek Yud Halacha Tesvav. The Rambam cites all of the distinctions between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. But Halacha Lemaisa, Pesach Sheni is not brought b'tumah. Good, Rabbi say. With that, let's go ahead and begin the next Mishnah just for a minute, so you can at least pick up here tomorrow. Ha-Pesach sheba b'tumah. We'll say if Pesach, again, back to Pesach Rishon. Back to Pesach Rishon now. Pesach haba b'tumah, lo yochlu menu zaven v'zavas, nidos v'yoldos. So we'll say if a Pesach is brought b'tumah, it's actually very interesting. Now, what we're going to see is the paradigmatic case of tumah is tumas meis. So what happens if the carbon is brought b'tumah? Remember again, what's the case here? The case over here is where the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei. In which case, again, Karban Pesach is going to be brought b'tumah. The Mishnah is saying that even if Karban Pesach is brought b'tumah, not everyone who's tamei has the ability to partake of it. Therefore, for example, Zavin Zavos, Nidos Yoldos, do not eat from the Karban Pesach. V'machlu, but if they did eat from the Karban Pesach, Termikaris. There's no chi of karis. In other words, you're not allowed to eat from the Pesach. But halacha l'maisa, there's no liability. Rabbi Eliezer poter af al biyas hamikdash. Rabbi Eliezer says you're even poter from coming to the Beis Hamikdash in a state of tumah when the carbon is offered up in a state of tumah. Says the Gemara Tan Rabbanon zavin v'zavos nidos v'yoldos she'achlu b'Pesach sheba b'tumah. If you have a case of zavin zavos nidos yoldos who ate of a Pesach that was brought b'tumah, which also means the current Pesach Rishon was brought because 51% of the klal was tamei tumas meis. These and other individuals are still not permitted to partake of the karban. But if they did so, ultimately, again, Yachul Yuchayav, and you might have thought that they would be Chayiv Tamalomar, the Chaltar Yochal Basra Vanefresh Shatocha Basra Zevach Hashem Shal Hashem, Vitum Asra Love V'Nichrasa. When is there kares for consumption of a karban by a Tameh individual? Ne'achal Tahorim, Tachayavan Alav Mishum Tameh. When the carbon is consumed by people who are tahor, that's when someone who is tamei is chayiv kares for consumption. V'she'eno ne'achol tahorin ein tamein chayav and alav mishum tamei. But when the carbon is not being consumed by those who are tahor, when the carbon is being consumed by those who are tamei, others who are tamei who consume it will not be chayiv. We'll stop over here. We'll pick up in Mirat Hashem with. I'm sorry, we went through that quickly. We'll pick up with this discussion in Mirat Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. Okay. We're still going to continue, if that's all right. Yeah.